All right, today I'm going to talk about something that I have been talking about here in the last few years, several years. I've been telling a story. If you haven't heard the previous chapters to this story, it doesn't make any difference. You'll be able to understand what I'm talking about. I'm going to be talking about a particular aspect of our tradition, that is our religious tradition. Presbyterians sometimes, more than shall we say, Dutch Reformed, Presbyterians sometimes are not aware that we are part of the Reformed Protestant tradition. Reformed, not Reformed Jews, but Reformed Protestants. That's who we are. That's who we are historically. It goes back to, and here I'm going to give you some dates, it goes back to the 1520s. So think about that. We're in in this decade, we are in the 500th anniversary. The 500th anniversary of the development of Reformed Protestantism. And that label emerged that early, even before Calvin. Calvin's 1540s and after. It's in the 1520s. And it arises because there is a group of people in mainly the southern part of German-speaking Europe. Capture that. So the southern part of German-speaking Europe, Holy Roman Empire, city-states mainly. There's an empire, but really they're self-governing cities, and that's a very important part of the whole story. Self-governing cities, if you've traveled in Europe, you will know those cities well. Strasbourg, Zurich, farther north, well, anyway, Basel would be another one, exactly. German-speaking cities. And sort of if you want to have, there are actually 4 or 5 figures who are the real founding fathers. The key man is Zwingli, a man called Zwingli, Ulrich Zwingli, who held forth in Zurich. If you go to that great cathedral in Europe, it's worth going to. If you get to Zurich, beautiful cathedral. It was sort of you might say the beginning of Protestant worship in our sense. Now, the word Reformed was quickly claimed already in the 1520s and 30s. These are people who are calling themselves Reformed, and it's a little bit of a boast. We're Reformed. Well, what's the boast? Well, the big issue in the Reformation, conceptually and practically, was this. These are people who, for one reason or another, are leaving Roman Catholicism. They are all Roman Catholics. They were raised as Roman Catholics. But they're leaving Roman Catholicism, and to be fair, they're leaving Roman Catholicism in large measure because of the initiative of Martin Luther. Martin Luther is the great font of this kind of activity. But as the story begins to develop, and it develops very quickly, Luther does his great initiative in 1517. That's the date that we always, so the iconic date of the posting of those theses and all of that. 1517. Already by the 1520s, there's a split. And the Catholic friends say, look, the ink was hardly dry on those theses, and bam, you've got a split. And the split was between the Lutherans and the Reformed. The Reformed said, we're more Reformed than you are. and it was literally true, because on virtually every issue of consequence, liturgy, church government, sacrament, I was thinking about it this morning as you were pronouncing those words, in all of those cases, they were departing, and in some cases rather dramatically, from Roman Catholic practice. I like to put it this way, in the sort of development of the Reformation, the Lutherans were inclined to take maybe a step and a half away from Roman Catholicism. The Anglicans, I don't think even a half. Well, that's a little strong. Maybe one step. But in contrast, the Reformed were inclined to take a lot of steps away. They didn't go as far as the Anabaptists, but they were known as Reformed, and that was the title they claimed right away. Yes, we are Reformed. Yes, we are Reformed. And another phrase that went with that was, just love this language, truly Reformed. There's actually a wonderful book on this whole topic with this title, Christ's Churches Truly Reformed. And it's 400 pages on the Reformed tradition. And by the way, they would boast that, or not just boast, they would assert it kind of proudly. If you look at our creeds, our confessions, they're like, ooh. And the obvious question is, what's the standard for that? Important point in the talk here. What's the standard for truly reform? Their claim was, we are returning to Scripture. They are critiquing everything that they have learned, everything they had absorbed on the basis of their reading of Scripture. Their reading of Scripture, to be sure, but they're constantly insisting we're more scriptural. We are more truly scriptural than those Lutherans, certainly much more so than those Anglicans who still use words like priest. So that's the Reformed tradition. That's what we're talking about. Not Anglican, not Lutheran. In time, all sorts of other labels develop, Presbyterian, Congregationalist in particular, that's a split, which develops in the English-speaking world some decades later. The Reformed tradition has existed for 500 years. Just two quick points about it. There are now 85 million Reformed Protestants scattered around the world. That's not huge. That's a sort of moderate group. That's still 85 million. And 85 million increasingly who are found in outside the orbit of the European world. Places like Brazil, certain countries in the Middle East, believe it or not, and of course Korea and China. China, there's now a growing sort of Reformed Protestant part of the growing Christian population in China. So 85 million. I have a rather cynical friend who likes to poke me occasionally on this and say, are there any more? Yes, there are more, 85 million. The implication that this is a dying group. No, not at all. But I have to say, the center of action is moving south. The center of action is moving, especially in terms of church growth. The center of action is moving south. Now, I'm talking about one part of the tradition. That's all. I mean, you can talk about it in terms of its theology, its liturgy, its church organization. I'm talking about one thing, just one part of it, which happens to be very interesting to note this, one of the most prominent aspects at the beginning and thereafter, and that is politics. There is a very intense focus on civil politics, I'm talking about civil government, on the part of these Reformed Protestants in this period. And not only are they, and they're engaged, and here's what they say. Calvin says, in one of the most important statements ever made by a Reformed Protestant, and it's the last chapter in the Institutes of the Christian Revelation, his great magnum opus. Book 4, chapter 20, Civil Government. Book 4, it's a marvelous treatise to this. It's the only thing we've got. We haven't got a whole book, but we've got that. And it turned out to be extraordinarily influential in the development of Reformed Protestant thinking. Calvin says there the following, and it's kind of shocking to see it read. Civil politics is a high calling, not for everybody, but for those who are called with the proper skills and interests and so forth. It is a high calling, and then he says it is a sacred ministry, comparable to the ministry of the clergy. Now, you can't get a more elevated notion of politics in Christian political camp. You can't find it. The closest thing to it is certain Catholic statements, interestingly enough, but only in a very qualified way. This is much more unambiguous. And of course, it's related to the fact, one of the great features of the Reformed Protestant tradition, in my opinion, this idea that in the church, laity and clergy work together in leadership. It's not laity sort of helping the clergy, it's working together. It's a very important idea. And there, so Calvin and others, Zwingli and others, kind of urged the people who have that sort of interest, go into politics. Seek to become a magistrate, and it's an inclusive notion. Seek to become a judge. Seek to become a diplomat. But by the way, prior to the quashing of the Huguenots in France, the majority of people who worked as diplomats in France were Protestants. These Huguenots. So anyway. So you have this idea: civil politics is a high calling. And that is related, so naturally, these people do go into civil politics and treat it as a calling. And treat it prayerfully, with dedication, as something that really is, they are doing God's will by entering into civil politics. In contrast, for example, to a lot of Christians in other traditions, not all, but some, say politics is dirty business. There's a whole tradition of Christians, and by the way, who say, look, there's no evidence of political involvement on the part of the early church. Why would we now get involved in politics? I'm not going to answer that question now, but that's a really interesting issue. The other thing that happens I'm going to call it the foundational period. Let me give you a couple of other dates. Remember I said it starts in the 1520s and 30s? I want to suggest to you that the laying of the foundations of this tradition was about a 150-year process, running from the 1520s through the 1680s and 90s. Why do I frame it that way? Because by the end of the 17th century, the 1680s and 90s, the passions generated by the Reformation were cooler. People sort of got over killing each other, to be honest, over Reformation issues. And also, to some extent, the great struggle for control of different countries was now settling down. But through that long period, that the Puritans and all of that, they are struggling for territorial control. What country is this going to be, a Catholic country, a Protestant country, religious wars? And then that comes pretty much to an end, and you get in the 1700s a very different chapter unfolding. Now, before I move beyond, I'm about to move beyond that, but let me add one other thing. The other thing that really interests me as a student of political ideas is that in this period, this laying of the foundations period, our spiritual forebears were writing very sophisticated treatises about it, theorizing about it. So much so that by the time this unfolds, people who are students of these ideas will say, this is a whole tradition. This is a whole tradition comparable to the Roman Catholic tradition, which is an amazing thing, because they have an enormous elaborate body of thought. So you have at least, I won't bore you with details, all the titles are in Latin, but that's the language, the universal language of the time. You've got, I would say, at least a dozen works, which to this day are identified as important contributions to Western political. 10, 12 works, imagine. So here's a tradition, a particular variant of Christianity that is really strongly drawn to politics, and then secondly, thinking about it, theorizing, and some of the theorizing, most of the theorizing, not all, is done by lay people. That's another thing. They're jurists, they're diplomats, etc. So in previous talks in this room, previous years, I've talked about the foundations, and I'm not going to go over that again. My interest in this series is the following. I'm interested now in focusing on what happens to those ideas once the passions are cooled and you're moving into a different era. And I hope you see what that means. That's the development of a tradition. That's how traditions develop. The foundations are laid, and the ideas that were laid in the foundation were passed on to people, and not just passed on to them, but they grabbed it because they like it. They're comfortable with it. And so with a tradition, you've got an inheritance from the past that is embraced. But these people are confronted with new circumstances. We're not living back then. That's always our problem. We're living in a different time than people a century before. So traditions develop in the following way. You take an inheritance, you relate it to a new circumstance, and you see how people use those resources creatively to interact with the new situation, and the tradition changes. Got it? Got it? So this is a part of the story. I'll be telling more of it in the next couple of weeks about a development of this tradition. And now I'm going to talk about I'm going to focus in on a specific time period. And that is 1870s through World War I. It was characterized in the publicity as the industrial era, and I offered that because that's a good way of thinking. This is the age in which industrialization is really going full bore. The United States, for example, before the time of the Civil War, was an agrarian country. And then in the aftermath of the Civil War, you get a just sort of dramatic surge. Much of it promoted, I have to say, by the government to industrialize the country. The United States, by the time of the First World War, has become an industrial power. And the United States is not alone in that. This is the era in which, let me give you a definition of industrialization. I can give you a one word, one phrase definition, which pretty well captures it. It's the use of inanimate sources of energy. That's industrialization. Before industrialization, if you wanted to produce something, essentially you had two sources of energy.
Horses.
Exactly. Or horses. But animate, you see, animate. And I hope you see this is, it's not complicated at all. You get the invention of machines which do that work and do it more effectively in terms of energy. And I hope you see we're living in that world to this day. The substitution of inanimate sources of energy for animate. And by the way, I'm going to be talking next week about political economy. Those of you who are interested, that's a very fascinating part of this. Economics, political economy. This is the period in which economic growth begins to become a hot idea. Why would you talk about it before? You didn't, it was not a possibility. But once you get this new thing, these machines, now you can think about expanding the set of resources available, goods and services. You can make more money. So that's the period we're talking about in which conditions change dramatically. And I hope you see how this is really a whole new world that's opening up. Whole new world. You know, Thomas Jefferson, I think, would have been puzzled by this world. You know, he was an agrarian guy. In a sense, he actually had an agrarian ideal. You know, the whole farmer. Exactly. Whole nation full of farmers. Well, this just upends that dramatically. Now, how did our spiritual forebears react to that? And I want to talk about it today about the topic of democracy and democratization. Next week, as I said, I'm going to talk about political economy. It's a fascinating story, by the way. Our spiritual forebears were very interested in economics, maybe not surprisingly, and they embraced theories about that. Anyway, that's coming next week, a preview of coming attractions. And then the following week, I'm going to talk about empire. This is an age in which those great empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, and so forth, emerges. And how did they think about that? And if they affirmed it, why would they affirm it? And, you know, by the way, just where that comes, where that leads us. The Protestants, especially Reformed Protestants, good, strong proponents of national independence. That was part of their sort of approach to politics in Western Europe. Well, if you're building empires and you're dominating other people, how do those two things go together? That's what we're going to talk about 2 weeks from now. Democracy. Why are we talking about democracy in this period? Because it was one of the hottest, most conflicted issues of all. Now, when I taught at Georgetown, I found that students really needed to be reminded of the following. And once they got it, and then the whole thought process opened up for them. I would stress in the beginning of certain classes, democracy for most of recorded history has been viewed as a bad idea. A really bad idea. A stupid idea. A really bad idea. And of course, most students walk into that class, including from other countries, other parts of the world, walk into that with sort of, I was still teaching mainly in the 20th century as opposed to the 21st, but you know, with the assumption that democracy is obviously a good thing, any rational person would, no. That begins to change in the late 1700s, not before. And it develops slowly, with enormous resistance. And I'm not talking about just people who had a stake in putting down the masses. I'm talking about people who were very thoughtful, trying to make sense of what was the best thing. Very well-intentioned people who would still say, "This is really a bad idea. You don't want to do that, do you?" Now, once we get to this period, 1870s and after, one thing is settled, which is important to note, and that is there were certain countries that were identified as Protestant. The dust had settled. Protestants had won in those countries. And in particular, there were certain countries that were Lutheran, certain countries that were Anglican, you know what that is, and certain countries that were identified as Reformed Protestant. And I'm going to name four of them here so that you will get a little picture in your mind. Switzerland, Reformed Protestant. Not unambiguously Reformed Protestant because it's got a large Catholic population and Catholic cantons, but still there was an assumption that you could carve off a part of Switzerland and it was unambiguously Reformed Protestant. Netherlands is another. Scotland is another. The United States of America is another. Because the vast majority of people at the time of the founding were Reformed Protestant. Vast majority. Congregationalists, Presbyterians, they're overwhelming. So now, why do I bring up these names? By the way, sometimes England is thrown in there because of the dissenting churches, which played such an important political role, but I'm going to leave that one off. I just want to mention these four. In the writing, the scholarly writing, and sort of, shall we say, the informed political writing on the political leaders and so forth, in this period, and leading up to this period, so the middle of the 19th century, the assumption was in those Reformed Protestant countries, they are more democratic than anybody else. And certainly they're more democratic than the Roman Catholics, who are adamantly opposed to it. They're some of the most articulate voices on the anti-democratic side. Terrible idea. But Reformed Protestant countries, the ones I named in particular, were thought to be not just democratic, but relatively well-established democracies. For this reason, they had free, fair elections. Fair has to be in quotation marks, but free, fair elections. And in other words, the way to state this would be to say they had regular accountability. So there were regular elections. The winning party didn't declare the last election to be the last one. So those countries they were held up. You know, a figure like Montesquieu, for example, French political commentator who was very influential in the thinking of the American founders, said these are countries in which democratic ideas have taken hold in a way that is remarkable. And it was linked to Reformed Protestantism on the part of a figure like Montesquieu. That's the reason they're that way is because their religion is that way. Now that's prolegomena to what I'm going to be talking about today. I've been taking a long time to get you to a particular point. Here's the particular point. They were democratic, to be sure, unambiguously democratic in that sense, but only in that sense. Only in that sense. Why do I say that? Because of the size of the electorate. The size of the electorate going into this period, size of the electorate is overwhelmingly restricted by three considerations: class, gender, and race. Who can vote? Who can vote? Well, all right.
White male landowners.
You got the drift. Here, let me fill in the detail. It astonishes people today to learn the facts, especially my students, very well-intentioned, smart kids. And I have to remind them that up to 1828, for example, the United States really didn't have democratic elections in any recognizable sense today. One, because large percentage of and of course it was determined by state, so it varied by state, but a good significant portion of the males could not vote. I say 1828 because that is commonly recognized today among historians to be the first really democratic, in quotation marks, election that the United States had. By the way, that's the beginning of Jacksonian democracy. Very interesting sort of transformation of American politics. In Britain, there was almost war over enfranchising the working class. Let me give you an example. In 1860, there were three big efforts to enfranchise the male working class, not anybody else, the male working class. 1830s, 1860s, 1880s, and in every single, and these were attempts to sort of widen the range of participation based on all kinds of conditions. You know, have you gone to school? Are you properly educated? Well, okay, that kind of working class person might be let in. Well, okay, that expands the electorate by 10%. And by the way, before the reforms that happened in the 1830s, it was less than 10% of British males who could vote. Less than 10%. And then over the course of that century, you get push, 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 push. And by the end of that century, you've got in England, which is commonly recognized to be one of the great, progressive countries in this, you're finally getting to the point where males in working class form, and by the way, one of the problems for the working class is that they don't own property in the recognized form. Mm-hmm. They don't own property. They work hard. They've got jobs, etc., but they don't own the right kind of property. Mm-hmm. So there's a big struggle over, and by the way, it happens in one country after another. And one of the reasons why European politics in the 19th century, the European countries, is so fraught with revolutionary ferment. 1848, 1871, and so forth, governments constantly being tested, being overthrown in places. A lot of that had to do with the simple question of democracy for males, just males. Mm-hmm. And I had students read, for example, a famous work by John Stuart Mill on this topic, where he's trying to explain to his fellow liberals why this might be advisable, and clearly the implication is that if we don't do this, we're probably going to have a revolution, like the French Revolution. So, beware, guys. So that's the first thing. You've got an intense struggle over class. You have an almost equally intense struggle over gender. Very, very complicated debates take place all the way through the 19th century as you get suffragette movements of one kind or another, who typically also who are closely related to, in the American case, the struggle over slavery. They're sort of intertwined. Many of the people who were suffragettes were also abolitionists or something approaching abolitionists. There's a very sort of dramatic development over time as more and more, by the way, not all women at the beginning as this unfolded were in favor. They absorbed those arguments that he can cast your vote for you. You are represented. You are represented by his vote. That kind of thing. Let me just say parenthetically, my wife and I lived in Switzerland in the 1960s. Switzerland finally, after several failed efforts, gave the vote to women in 1971. So this was a long struggle, okay? And we were exposed during that time when we lived in Geneva. We were exposed to these arguments, sometimes made by women. This is not unnecessary. Why do we have to think about this? All right, so you have intense struggles over gender in politics, raising very, very fundamental questions when you think about it, about a woman's role in society. Is this the proper place for women? Is it unwomanly to be involved in that realm, etc.? John Stuart Mill, in a famous work that I commend to you if you're interested in it, written in the 1860s and in the great struggle over this issue, the first time it finally really comes to a head in Britain. In 1860s, he writes a work called The Subjection of Women. And he drew analogies in that work to the disenfranchisement of women, between that and the disenfranchisement of people of color. He said they're analogous. They're not the same, but there's an analogy. So, slavery. Gender. Gender is a huge divide. And by the way, most of the openings for women to get the vote occur in the 20th century, not the 19th century. Anybody know what country was the first one to enfranchise women? What would you guess? Think about the whole world.
Sweden.
Brazil.
Good guess. That would be good. It was New Zealand. New Zealand. Isn't that kind of interesting? You know, given their recent history. New Zealand, 1908. Women got to vote. Everybody, I assume everybody knows here. Women got to vote in this country when? 19, after the aftermath of the First World War, and it was sort of actualized in 1912. And in between, by the way, the United States was a laggard. It was way behind a whole series of other countries. Another interesting thing in light of current politics, some of the earliest countries were Baltic countries, Lithuania and various others. So, but no, what I'm creating, I hope, an image in your mind. A long slog, you know, with regard to class, long slog to get beyond white males of a certain level of property, education, and so forth. So those are, and then of course there's the issue of race. Terrible struggle, which initially was in this country, and of course it was in other countries as well, but the United States in particular. The United States on this issue has, to some extent, a peculiar history. And let me just say one thing as an aside about that. When very robust defenses of slavery were mounted in many of the southern part of the United States in the years leading up to this theological defenses, Presbyterian seminary articulating the idea that slavery was in the providence of God. Overwhelmingly, the rest of Reformed Protestant world rejected that. It's so interesting. The thing that's important to note about that is, once you see the sort, I'm going to say sordid history of American Protestant reform on this topic, it is very interesting, of course, to ponder the question: is there something inherently racist, especially when you factor in South Africa? Is there something inherently racist about the Reformed tradition? My answer to that is no. This is the peculiarity of a couple of places. A couple of places where, in particular, plantation economies were dominant. Exactly. Anyway, I'm getting off track here. As the movement for abolition unfolds, abolitionism, as that movement unfolds, naturally, a part of the package, not frankly the first thing, but a part of the package. Well, are we going to allow these people to vote? By the way, the initial impulse on the part of many good white Protestants in the period leading up to the Civil War was, yeah, we can liberate them, but please send them back to Africa. American Colonization Society, with very strong participation from Presbyterians and congregations. Yeah, they should be free, but please send them home. Which, by the way, African Americans on the whole said absolutely no. There were African American clergy, Presbyterian clergy, who led the resistance. That is not what we want. We want to live in this country to which we have been brought. Next question. You're going to free them. What about vote? And of course, that was settled sort of by the amendments to the Constitution at the time of the Civil War, aftermath of the Civil War, but only sort of, I hope you understand, because then you have this whole business of sort of the attempt to reverse Reconstruction, which means that for all practical purposes, there were some exceptions, but for all practical purposes, the enfranchisement of blacks did not occur until the 1960s. Till the 1960s. It was sort of reversed in a sense, de jure, in a sense, 1860s, but not really, because of the practical implication, the resistance. All right. So we know how the story we know how the story turned out, although I think it's still unfolding. I hate to say. I think it's still unfolding. Now, let me try to summarize and then go to the last part of my talk. I like to think of this whole thing as democratization. Democracy in stages. Remember, you had countries that were, to begin with, recognized to be rather unusual in their commitment to free and fair elections, regular elections, accountability, Some people thought it was remarkable. And it was remarkable. And then in those countries, immediately people saying, well, yeah, but the size of the electorate, all these exclusions. Exclusion on grounds of class, exclusion on grounds of gender, exclusion on grounds of race. You put all that together, you probably got a minority of the population voting. Is that democratic? And I pose that not as a rhetorical question, but a serious question that was debated all the time in all this period. But generally, we know the trend of this is towards what? Overcoming those restrictions. Moving in the direction of a more, not fully, but a more comprehensive electorate. Okay? What was the Reformed Protestant response to that? This is the era, I'll be talking about it more next week, of the social gospel, Washington Gladden, Josiah Strong, and their critics as well. I'll give you more names next week. I'm just painting a general picture here. What was their response? And in Europe, in Europe, they were facing it all the time. Well, generally their response was kind of what you'd expect, given the fact that these countries were the ones that took the lead in laying that foundation to start with. The Reformed Protestant response to this trend, this democratization trend, was to say, yes, it's a good idea. But with conditions. Now, my guess is the conditions I'm about to articulate would probably generate a very interesting discussion here if I were to stop talking, because they raise very interesting issues. On the whole, our Reformed Protestant forebears looked at all this, reacted to it. In some cases, were directly involved in these struggles. By the way, this is the period also of Woodrow Wilson, somebody that's has definite Presbyterian roots, son of the Mans, etc. Yes. In principle, this is a good thing, but with conditions. But even before I get to the conditions, the response was decently and in order. You know that phrase? Yeah. Biblical. Mm-hmm. Biblical. John Calvin made a kind of an ethic out of it. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think it's a great ethic. And I've been reminded of it in recent days for maybe obvious reasons. Decently and in order. You know? Calvin, it was a fascinating figure because he, on the one hand, was promoting insurrection all over the place, but he still believed that the right way for change to occur was decently and in order. Mm-hmm. Decently and in order. So you're looking at this process of democratization, which is turbulent. You know, people literally fighting in the streets. You know, there were riots in London in particular. Decently and in order. And that they translated it into the following idea: gradual. Gradual. Not just leaping into it. Eloquent defenses of gradualism. If you leap into something, it's going to have bad results. Leap into something, you're going to have bad results. So that was their kind of their mantra with respect to democratization. And related to that were these conditions. They believed, let's see if I get this right. They believed that the vote was in principle a right, but it was also a privilege. A right, but also a privilege. Meaning what? Well, that you, in order to, you might say, actualize or fully claim this right, you needed to be a certain kind of person. And they're just perfectly reformed in what I'm about to say. They were drawing their whole experience of the past, but their experience in the church as well as in the civil realm. The main thing they emphasized was education. Keep in mind that this tradition has a long, I would say, glorious history of creating schools and insisting upon people. If you're gonna have a church that's really based upon the Bible, people have got to be able to read, and not only to read, but be able to think about complicated ideas. And you need to have a learned clergy, not just any old standing up there in the pulpit, and so on. So consistent with that tradition. And by the way, literacy above all, literacy is, but not just literacy. it's other elements of education. And they were very, very committed to the idea that working class people, for example, should be given opportunities to learn and become, and there was a very strong insistence that only people who really were literate, but not just literate, but reasonably well educated, qualified to realize this right. So it's a right in principle, but you don't just get it because you're a human being, because you're alive. No, you get this or should get this right because you have met certain conditions. Another one that was very common in all this was you need to be an upstanding person. Very first. You need, and what did that mean? And by the way, this is so easily caricatured and mocked, you can imagine. But here was the argument. And you can imagine the debates that would go on between Presbyterians, who tended to be upper middle class, as they are to this day, and working class people. Working class people would push back, I can't be upstanding in the way that you are. That's beyond my life experience. Maybe my children, but not me. Well, the retort was this. Do you have a job? A stable job? Do you pay taxes? Do you responsibly raise your children? Assume responsibility for their so forth? I hope you see a certain image for me. Are you thrifty? That's another one. Are you thrifty, or do you when you get your paycheck, do you probably pop into the local bar? I hope you see a certain ethic is being framed here. Frugality in industry. You know what this is. Frugality, industry, broadly a kind of responsible approach to life. You don't indulge your passions all the time. You moderate them in order to lead a disciplined approach to life. Now, I kid you not, this was kind of part of the Reformed Protestant agenda. It was perfectly consistent with their whole approach to life. This is what it means to be. Oh, the other thing was, do you take responsibility for being informed about civic affairs? That's a good one. Do you take responsibility for being informed about civic affairs, or do you just think you can pop into the polling booth? No. We want, and here comes another part of this, we want good citizens. Good citizens. And until those conditions are met, the process of expansion of the electorate should be cautious and slow. I hope you see. Where we're headed, where we want to go, is an electorate that's full of responsible people who are well educated, who've done it.
It was still largely male. I mean, to this day, the Southern Presbyterians don't take women ministers.
No, they do. You turn with the PCA. That's what they do. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I know that.
So, one final condition, one final thought about this, and then I will shut up. At least shut up in this way. I hope it's clear what this is all about. This is a gradualist approach that emphasizes conditions. And I think any person who believes these things would say, well, this is what God intended. God intended it for us to be, responsible people. Develop our talents, apply them in a responsible way, raise our children in a responsible way. The opposite of what kind of cavalier living. One other thing, however, what was this? And that was a very strong moralism with respect to who qualifies to occupy public office. Very strong talk about character and public office. Only people of good character should even be considered for occupying public office. Only that, and by the way, it was kind of a mantra. How would we know what those people are? Well, they are kind of the upstanding person that I just described on steroids. Really upstanding. And being willing to sacrifice one's own good for the greater good. That was a big part of it. This person should be somebody who can be counted on to take the general good seriously and not just focus on personal selfish concern. Above all, they would, wag their fingers at people who would use public office for private gain. Oh, terrible, 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 terrible. And by the way, as a part of this, Emily will be pleased to learn, there were often election sermons.
Oh, really?
It was a great New England tradition, by the way, which gets steeped into the wider church. And the election sermons were very interesting. Not, the pastor would not stand up there and say, you should vote for him. Instead, they would moralize about politics and just about them. So they would kind of send you signals. Now, I just want to remind you, they would use biblical figures as sort of the exemplars of this. What kind of person was so and so, especially David on a good day, shall we say? David on a good day was a wonderful man, called of God. And of course the implication is, and we should find leaders like that. So, and by the way, it's very interesting to me that as the Reformed political tradition, I'm working on the whole tradition, as this moves forward, that particular theme declines in importance, at least in terms of emphasis. I think it's a great loss. I think it's entirely appropriate to be, shall we say, thoughtful about the qualities of a leader, quite independent of this particular election. That's a good conversation to have in life of the church. Difficult conversation, I can see, but I think a good conversation to have, which is different from, say, that candidate is the right one. That's a different conversation. Quite possible that you could say stateswomen appear in both parties or several. And just a final thought on that. And I will have to qualify my last observation with this comment. 20 years ago, my wife and I spent a wonderful year in Scotland when I was working on a project. And I was very interested how much there was an election going on. I was very struck by how many allusions to this idea of the good statesman and the qualities appropriate for moral leadership. You heard it in certain, especially at St. John's, in the preaching at St. John's, which is a sort of a national cathedral. By the way, if you ever go to Scotland, you've got to worship at St. John's. You've got to plan your trip in such a way, not just popping in on a Wednesday afternoon. You've got to worship at St. John's. You have a great music program here. They have a better one. Let me stop. We've got a few minutes here. Time for rebuttals. Yes.
Yeah, when you talked about democracy as a stage evolutionary process,
Yeah.
that's not exactly what you said, but I think that's what you meant. And why is that and what that can be? I was reminded in that book, and we talked about before the cause, it made a side by side between the French Revolution, which was basically a democratic revolution of the masses saying, look, we want to have a say in what happens in our country, and the American Revolution, which some historians, and it was in that book described, didn't get everything right initially. In other words, people made compromises, and we look back today and say, hey, those compromises, how come they tend to do that? And we're not, and some people are very critical of those compromises. But the American Revolution was successful, ultimately, but in a staged process, I think is what the cause kind of alluded to. But the French Revolution was not at that time, because they wanted, at least I'm in my interpretation, they wanted everything at once. We want everything at once, no compromises, and it kind of crashed.
Yeah, I would call only in one respect would I quarrel with that. It just happened. It wasn't.
No, it did happen.
The American Revolution had, to some extent, it also happened.
Yeah.
But there was more orchestration going on. By the way, the book he's mentioned, some of us in this room are fans of this book. I don't get any proceeds from the sale of it, but let me just commend it to you. It's a book called The Cause. It's on the American War for Independence. It's one of the best books on American history I've ever read, and I commend it to you. Some of the people in this room have read that book, and I've read a lot about American early colonial history, and I read that book, and I thought, man, I have learned a lot here. So, and he's a great writer. Joseph Ellis, The Cause. Everybody go read it. Next question. Next comment. Yes.
I was just thinking that as we all have listened to this history, and how we understand it and it's valuable. I worry about the children in our country, that whether they ever will know this, how things have developed.
Well, okay, you're onto a topic I can wax eloquent about for maybe longer than I should, but let me make two comments. Well, it's a great question. Let me say two things about it. Of course, that points to the importance of being well educated. And I've got a oldest grandson is looking at colleges right now. He's been accepted at certain places, so we're on the threshold of a decision. Grandpa is advising. Just advising. I'm not doing anything more than that. But I think getting that kind of, you're talking broadly about the value of liberal arts education. What we're looking at. The value of liberal arts education, in my opinion, for producing, in keeping with this theme, citizens, in addition to people who get jobs, it's only part of the purpose of education. For producing citizens is invaluable. That's my.
But it's on the wane.
Well, so
I'm a
what?
college professor.
I understand, well, I understand, but I agree, I agree.
They're all majoring in computers.
Well, no, not all, because, I mean, I taught, of course, in a place where these things are privileged, to be sure. That was one of the great things about Georgetown, that was really privileged. I didn't feel like I was off in a corner, I was teaching literally hundreds and hundreds of students. But, my experience in dealing with it, now granted, there are students of a certain kind. I think students of another kind might hear my lecture and say, oh, Lord, is he boring? But those students know, no. And that's frankly my hope for the large issue that you're posing.
Because it has to reach everybody. It can't just be the ones who.
Well, you know, I
study.
here I take her point. I would say we're in a difficult time, maybe dire time, with regard to that issue. So you have to think what can be done given that pressure driving us in another direction. And well, I can say more, but I'm going to leave it at that. But by the way, the other thing is, I do think I've devoted a lot of time to this. I think our churches have some responsibility to make people aware of the aspect of this that pertains to our tradition. What I got a hand, you know, I got a hand at another church I was speaking recently. And, you know, the friendly question was got a little edge. He said, why should we be concerned about this stuff? You know, it kind of implied that it was, well, my reaction is the following. Churches, like other institutions, but churches in particular in some respects, they all have a distinctive identity. You know that. You know, you're here. You're not at First Baptist or whatever. Yeah, exactly. You're here, okay? And I think the reason you're here, I'm not, it's a complex thing, but I think part of the reason you're here is because you're comfortable with the way the Christian life and the Christian community is understood and practiced. So that's the first thing. What I'm doing in these talks and all the stuff I've been doing over the years in this room is to unpack the genealogy of that set of practices and ideas. Now, to me, as a cradle Presbyterian, as they're called, I mean, it's a good term. You know, I've never been a member of anything but a Presbyterian church. My whole life has been in Presbyterian churches. For me, this is kind of unpacking who I am. And for those of you who are in that same position, why do I say that? Because a lot of times we're vaguely aware of what is part of this church as opposed to that church, but we don't know. It's a little bit like genealogy in the sort of more basic biographical. Why am I the way I am? Or another way to put it would be to say, why do I have, maybe this is the best way to put it, why do I have these instincts? In politics and why am I inclined to do this and not that? And by the way, one of the things that triggered my interest in it was spending my whole career in a Roman Catholic institution. I became acutely aware of the fact that I am really Protestant. And I have literally dozens and dozens of Catholic friends. And they joke about it with me, you know, and I joke about it with them, to be sure. Occasionally when somebody, one of those, every once in a while I have a conversation with some Jesuit of a certain kind, who was very interested in Presbyterian. Jesuits who want not an absolute monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy in the Roman Catholic Church, which of course has been an ancient, long aspiration, always denied. Some of the Jesuits at Georgetown I encountered were very interested in, of course, Presbyterians are really, from their point of view, a republic, because they're not even a constitutional democracy, a constitutional monarchy. So the obvious question for them is, how do these Presbyterians do things? And so I would ask questions like, you're an elder? What is an elder? How do you get to be an elder? What do elders do in the session? How does the session relate to the pastor? I'm fascinated by this question. Who's involved in selecting this pastor? And frankly, the answer blew their minds, and not entirely in a good way. I remember saying, one question I got was, well, who serves on these search committees? It must be a very select group. No. Yeah. So having served on a couple of them. And then of course that troubled, you know, they are Roman Catholics. So like, I mean, and the other one was, no bishop? I mean, this general presbyter really is a bishop. No, not really. Anyway, so you become aware in interaction with other people of other faiths of your own identity. And the obvious question is, how did this come to be? What are my instincts? And let me just conclude by saying, there are other people, probably in this room, who came to this church who were not Presbyterians. Well, the obvious question is, what attracted them? And presumably it's the same thing. It's, well, they're drawn to this place as opposed to that. And I would hope they would be drawn here, not just because of the parking. You know?
Thank you very much. Thank you. For
Politically kind.
politically
kind.
Well,
Talking about Adam Smith.
Bruce is killing me because I can't be here next week.
Oh!
How much of this